Let the day fall behind you. Find your comfort, and let your mind begin to slow. Gently, we'll drift through the long, wandering journey that carried Odysseus slowly home. If you find rest here, subscribe, and a new one will be ready each night. At the Panathenaic festival in Athens, under a sky already dark and full of stars, a man stands before a gathered crowd, holding a staff of polished wood. The staff marks him for what he is. It is not a weapon and not an ornament. It is the emblem of his profession, the thing he carries in place of a lyre, the visible sign that he has arrived to recite. He is a rhapsode, a singer of stitched song, and the word the Greeks used for what he does contains within it the image of something sewn together from parts, assembled from a store of pieces that his memory holds in an order so deeply learned it has become instinctive. The crowd around him is large. The night air of Athens in late summer carries the smell of oil lamps and the particular warmth that stone holds after a long hot day. He takes a breath. He raises his staff slightly, not dramatically, the way a craftsman adjusts his grip before beginning a familiar task. And then he opens his mouth, and the first line of the Odyssey moves outward across the gathered people in the dark. That first line names a man. It does not begin with the war, or the sea, or the gods, though all of those things arrive within a few more lines. It begins with the word for man, the Greek word that carries no article, set down at the very start of the line with a kind of absolute directness, as though the poem is declaring the terms of everything that follows from its first breath. A man. Describe for me the man. This is what the Odyssey asks of its singer in its opening word, and the rhapsode at the Panathenaic festival answers that request in the same way singers had been answering it for generations before him, and in the same way singers would continue to answer it for generations after, with the same phrases, the same metrical shapes, the same recurring words for the sea and for the dawn and for the long-enduring quality of the man at the center of the story, each phrase arriving in the hexameter line, the way a stone fits into a wall that has been built many times before, settling into its place without having to be forced. The pattern the rhapsode is working within is one that scholars did not fully understand until the 20th century, when an American classicist named Milman Parry began asking a question that seems simple now, but was genuinely new at the time. Parry, working in the 1920s and 1930s, wanted to know why the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey both, contained such an extraordinary number of repeated phrases. The same strings of words appeared again and again across thousands of lines, the same description of Odysseus, the same phrase for the sea at a certain shade or hour, the same names for the dawn. These repetitions had been noticed and catalogued before Parry, but they had been treated mostly as a curiosity or as a feature of poetic convention, or occasionally as evidence of carelessness on the part of whoever had assembled the poems. Parry proposed something entirely different. He argued that these phrases were not decorative and not accidental, and not the mark of a lazy or inattentive composer. They were functional. They were tools. Each repeated phrase in Parry's analysis was a formula, a unit of language designed to fit precisely within the dactylic hexameter line, the particular rhythmic pattern in which Greek epic poetry was composed. A line built from long and short syllables in repeating feet that gives Homeric verse its characteristic forward momentum, its rolling quality, the feeling of something always moving toward a resting point that keeps arriving and then opening again into another forward motion. The hexameter line is demanding to fill. It requires a very particular arrangement of sounds, and the composer who is working without a written text in front of him, who is composing aloud, in real time, in front of a listening crowd, cannot stop to reconsider his word choice without losing the thread of the performance entirely. The formula solved this problem. When the composer needed a phrase to describe the sea in a way that would complete a certain section of the line, he reached into his trained memory and drew out the phrase that fit, the phrase he had heard and absorbed and practiced until it was as automatic as breathing. When he needed to name Odysseus in a way that completed a different metrical position in the line, he reached for a different formula. The choice was not free invention in those moments. It was skilled deployment of a pre-existing system. The result, accumulated across thousands of lines, was a poem composed in performance from a vast store of memorized pieces assembled in real time. This does not mean the poems had no artistry, or that any competent practitioner could produce them with equal skill, or that the formulaic system made the composer's work mechanical. The formulae were the vocabulary, not the intelligence. What the singer did with them, how he arranged the inherited pieces, how he shaped the episodes, where he let the story pause and where he moved it forward, that remained the work of an individual mind, drawing on an individual understanding of the tradition. The formula made extended oral composition possible. They did not make it easy. Among the most recognizable of these inherited phrases are the epithets that attach to specific recurring elements of the poems. The sea called wine dark in the Greek, a phrase whose exact color has been debated without resolution for centuries, since the Greek word can shade from dark blue to red to purple depending on context, and perhaps on hour and season and the quality of light on a particular day. Dawn is rosy-fingered, the long compound adjective filling the beginning of the hexameter line with a precision that is both metrically useful and visually arresting, since dawn genuinely does arrive with something pink and gradual at its edges when the conditions are right and the sky is clear. Odysseus himself carries his epithet, polytalos in the Greek, the much enduring, the long-suffering, the one who has endured many things, an epithet that functions as a compressed characterization, carrying within its syllables the whole shape of what he is. Each of these phrases could be deployed in slightly different grammatical forms depending on where it was needed in the line, giving the singer flexibility within the system without requiring the system to be abandoned or reinvented. Parry did not arrive at his understanding of Homeric formula from the ancient texts alone. In the 1930s, he traveled to Yugoslavia, where a living tradition of oral epic poetry was still being practiced by singers called guslers, men who composed and performed long narrative poems in front of live audiences, using a stringed instrument called a gusler to accompany their recitation. Parry recorded these singers at work. He sat across a table from one of them and listened as the man composed and recited hundreds of lines without stopping, without hesitation, without a written text anywhere in the room, the same structural patterns appearing again and again in slightly different arrangements, new episodes assembled from familiar pieces, the way a mason assembles a new wall from a quarry of shaped stones. The comparison with Homer was immediate and clarifying. What Parry was watching was not what Homer had done. The Yugoslav tradition was its own tradition, operating in its own language, with its own conventions, and no direct line connected it to ancient Greece. But it demonstrated that the kind of composition Parry was positing for Homer was not theoretical. It was a real human capacity. Living singers had it. The Homeric poems were consistent with having been made by someone who had it too. Parry died young, before he could complete the full elaboration of his theory. His student Albert Lord continued the work, eventually publishing it in a book called The Singer of Tales, that became one of the foundational texts of Homeric scholarship in the second half of the 20th century. The framework Perry and Lord constructed has been refined and complicated and debated in the decades since. Scholars have raised questions about the degree of improvisation involved, about the role of tradition in constraining what any individual singer could actually invent, about whether the Odyssey and the Iliad, as they survive, represent the fixed products of a single brilliant singer, or the distilled result of a much longer tradition's accumulated choices. These questions are genuinely interesting. They have not been fully settled. The tradition carries them patiently, the way it has always carried the poems themselves, in a state of productive uncertainty that seems at this distance not like incompleteness, but like the natural condition of something very old and very large. What the rhapsode at the Panathenaic festival was doing then was something with roots far older than the festival itself. He was carrying a tradition of oral composition and performance that had been in motion for centuries before anyone wrote anything down, performing a poem that had been shaped and reshaped by generations of singers before him, each one working with the same store of phrases and the same general outline of the story, each one contributing something, a new emphasis, a more memorable arrangement, a slightly different handling of a particular episode, while the tradition absorbed those contributions and continued. The staff in his hand was the emblem of recitation rather than original composition, which is perhaps why it replaced the lyre that an earlier, more compositionally active tradition might have used. By the time of the Panathenaic festival, the singer was performing a received text, or something close to it. The text had not yet been written down in the sense we would recognize, but it had stabilized enough that its outline was fixed, its great episodes familiar, its formula so thoroughly embedded in the tradition that a trained rhapsode could carry them reliably in memory. The Panathenaic festival itself was held in Athens every 4 years in its grander version, called the Great Panathenaia, in honor of Athena, the goddess who, in the tradition of the Odyssey, was Odysseus's divine protector and advocate, the reason that any part of his homecoming was possible at all. The festival was one of the most important civic and religious events in the Athenian calendar. It involved athletic competitions, musical contests, processions, and sacrifice, and the rhapsodic competitions in which singers performed the Homeric poems in sequence, each rhapsode picking up where the previous one left off, were among the festival's most celebrated events. A regulation attributed to the Athenian statesman Solon, or to the tyrant Pisistratos, depending on the ancient source consulted, reportedly required that the Iliad and the Odyssey be performed in strict sequence at these competitions, one episode following the next in the order the tradition held. This rule, if it was enforced consistently, would have had an important effect on the poem's stability. When a text must be performed in sequence by many different singers over many iterations of the festival, the pressure to remember it accurately, in the same order, with the same episodes, following the same logic from beginning to end, becomes much greater than when any individual singer is free to rearrange or elaborate as personal preference dictates. The poems we have now in the Greek text that has come down through centuries of manuscript copying and scholarly editing are likely shaped in some important part by that standardizing pressure. They are not identical to what any single festival performance contained. The poems as written are very long, much longer than a single night's performance would encompass, and the relationship between live performance and fixed text is complicated and probably gradual. But the tradition of sequential performance at Panathenaica is one of the forces that helped the Odyssey become the Odyssey, a poem with a beginning, a middle, and an end that stayed in approximately the same place across the copies that eventually recorded it. The oldest evidence for that written form comes not from Greece, but from Egypt, at a site called Oxyrhynchus in Middle Egypt, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing into the 20th. Archaeologists and papyrologists excavated an extraordinarily large deposit of ancient papyrus, documents from what had been the rubbish heaps of a Greco-Roman town, a town where Greek was spoken and written, and where Greek literary culture had taken root during and after the period of Alexander's conquest. Among the hundreds of thousands of papyrus fragments eventually extracted from Oxyrhynchus were substantial numbers containing lines from the Homeric poems. These fragments date mostly to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, placing them within a few hundred years of whatever moment the Odyssey first took a relatively stable written form. They are not complete. They are pieces, strips, corners, scraps, edges, ragged and brown, the papyrus brittled and discolored by 2,000 years in the dry Egyptian soil. But the Greek letters are legible on the surviving portions, their ink faded but not gone, and when scholars read the lines those letters form, they find something recognizable, a version of the Odyssey that is clearly related to the text we have now, carrying the same basic structure, the same great scenes, the same formulaic phrases settling into the hexameter line in the same positions they have always occupied. A fragment carrying a few dozen lines of Book 9, the book that contains the Cyclops episode, one of the most famous sequences in the entire poem, might be narrow enough to cover with a single hand. The papyrus it is written on is not white, but the particular brown of very old plant matter, and the surface is slightly rough, and across that rough surface the ancient scribe's hand has moved with a practiced efficiency, the letters small and relatively consistent, the lines close together, the overall impression one of a skilled person doing a routine professional task, copying a familiar text onto a purchased medium for a reader who wanted it and paid for it. The scribe was not trying to make something beautiful. He was making something useful. The beauty the fragment has now is the beauty of survival, of duration, of the strange fact that something written on plant matter in Egypt in the 3rd century BCE can still be read in the 21st century CE. The same letters, the same words, the same Odysseus, blinded by the same wine-dark sea. After Oxyrhynchus and the other papyrus-bearing sites of Egypt, the next major evidence for the text of the Odyssey comes from the Byzantine period, specifically from manuscripts produced in the 10th and 11th century CE, a gap of roughly 1,200 years between the oldest substantial papyrus fragments and the oldest near-complete manuscripts. The manuscripts that survive from this period are copies made by scribes working in Byzantine scriptoria, rooms dedicated to the careful reproduction of texts, lit by candles or oil lamps, the work done in relative quiet, the scribe's pen moving across vellum or parchment in the particular focused silence of someone doing something slow and important. A scribe in a 10th century scriptorium copying the Odyssey was probably working from an older manuscript, now lost, which was itself a copy of something older, and that copy a copy of something older still, the chain of transmission running backward through the silence of the centuries toward whatever original written form the poem first took, in whatever time and place that happened. The scribes who copied the Odyssey in Byzantine scriptoria were not passive conduits. They made decisions. They corrected what they thought were errors in their source manuscripts. They sometimes introduced errors of their own. They occasionally annotated the text or preserved in the margins the opinions of older scholars about difficult words or debated readings. What they were doing was not simply reproduction. It was a form of engagement with a living tradition, shaped by their own education and judgment and the scholarly conventions of their time and place. The manuscripts that emerge from their work are not identical to one another, and the work of comparing them and establishing a reliable edited text occupied Homeric scholars for centuries and continues in a more refined form today. This is not a cause for alarm. It is the normal condition of any text that has traveled a long way across time, accumulating the marks of every mind that handled it, arriving at the present not as a single fixed object, but as a family of related versions, whose relationships scholars can trace and weigh. What the rhapsode at the Panathenaic festival was performing then, and what the scribe in the Byzantine scriptorium was copying, and what the papyrus fragment from Oxyrhynchus preserves in its few dozen brown and faded lines, are all points on the same long arc, a story that began as sound, as a voice in the air before a listening crowd, and became ink on papyrus, and then ink on vellum, and then ink on paper, and then the text that scholars edit and annotate and translate and read aloud in their own ways in their own times. The story still moving, still in transit, still carrying the same man across the same restless sea toward the same fixed point of home. The question of who composed the Odyssey in anything like its present form, whether the poem originated with a single individual of extraordinary gifts whom the tradition calls Homer, or whether it is the product of a longer process of gradual accumulation and refinement that may have involved many singers contributing to a tradition that only slowly arrived at the shape we now recognize, has been debated since antiquity. Ancient scholars at the Library of Alexandria argued about it. Renaissance humanists argued about it. Modern classicists argue about it in peer-reviewed journals, with access to all the evidence that has accumulated since. The debate is called the Homeric question, and it remains genuinely open, which is to say that no one has produced an argument conclusive enough to end the conversation. This is interesting. It is one of the more interesting features of the Odyssey's afterlife, that a poem about a man whose identity becomes the central problem of his own story, who survives by becoming nobody, who must be recognized upon his return home by those who have forgotten or doubted what he looks like, should itself be a poem whose authorship is permanently in question. The name attached to it, more a placeholder for a tradition than a documented individual. What is not in question is that the poem exists, that it has existed in some form for at least 2,500 years, and in something close to its current form for at least as long as the oldest papyrus fragments, and in a tradition of oral composition for probably longer than either of those measures can establish. It is a very old story. Whatever the circumstances of its making, the story has endured past most of what existed alongside it, outlasting empires and languages and the physical materials on which it was recorded, moving from singer to singer and scroll to scroll and manuscript to manuscript with a persistence that is simply a fact about it, not a metaphor for anything else. The formula that places the phrase for rosy-fingered dawn at the beginning of the hexameter line does so not because the poet deliberated over the choice in the moment of composition, but because the phrase fits the metrical position, and because the training of the oral tradition had placed it so deeply into the singer's memory that it arrived without being summoned, the way a hand finds a familiar tool in the dark. The hand does not decide to reach for the tool. The familiarity itself guides the movement. The formula works the same way, a piece of inherited language, shaped by the pressures of rhythm and repetition over generations of performance, arriving in the line because the line requires exactly what the formula provides. Dawn is rosy-fingered, The sea is wine dark. Odysseus endures. These phrases are not decoration. They are the structure of the poem's memory, and the memory it held in the minds of rhapsodes who performed at the Panathenaea across many generations of festival competitions. It held in the hands of scribes in Egypt and Byzantium who copied one manuscript from another in the particular silence of rooms dedicated to that work. It held in the brown papyrus strips excavated from the rubbish heaps of Oxyrhynchus, their edges ragged, their letters faded but legible, their few surviving lines of Greek still carrying the shape of the story they were written to preserve. There is something in that persistence that feels less like triumph than like patience, the patience of a very long thing that is in no hurry, because duration is simply what it does. The story moving quietly through whatever medium is available, asking only that some person somewhere know it well enough to pass it on. The papyrus fragments from Oxyrhynchus that carry the Odyssey are held now in museum collections in Oxford and elsewhere, stored in controlled conditions, in drawers or cases designed to slow the ordinary processes of time. Between exhibitions, in the dim light of storage, a strip of papyrus no wider than a hand rests in its tray, its brown surface carrying those few dozen lines of ancient Greek, the poem's words still there in the ink that dried on them more than 2,000 years ago, the letters patient and legible in the low light, the story of a man still trying to get home preserved in a fragment of a plant that grew beside the Nile, in a country that never knew him, copied by a hand that has been gone for centuries onto a surface that has survived them both. The story was already old when that scribe wrote it down. It has only grown older since. The papyrus rests in the quiet of the storage room. The letters hold. The story is still there. 12 ships moved on a calm sea in the early morning, their oars working in long, unhurried strokes through water the color of pale iron. Behind them, on the horizon, a column of smoke still climbed into the brightening sky, the last visible sign of a city that had burned through the night. The men at the oars did not turn to look at it. They faced forward, as rowers must, and the smoke receded behind them with each stroke, growing thinner against the sky, becoming less a fire and more a memory of one, until the horizon held only its own long, unbroken line. Troy had fallen after 10 years. The stratagem that finally broke it was not a siege engine or a direct assault, but a hollow wooden horse, enormous, left on the beach as though abandoned, the Greek fleet apparently gone. The Trojans had debated what to do with it. Some had argued for burning it where it stood, or rolling it into the sea. Others had prevailed, and the horse was brought inside the walls, and the men hidden in its belly had waited in the dark until the city slept. What followed in the night belonged to the tradition's accounting of war's end. The gates opened, the fleet returned from where it had been waiting just beyond sight, the city taken from within and without, at once. By morning, Troy was no longer a city in any meaningful sense. Its walls still stood in places, its name would continue to be spoken, but the place itself, the inhabited, organized, living place, was finished. The Greeks who sailed from that burning coastline carried with them the weight of what the sack had involved, and the tradition holds that this weight was not only human, but divine. Among the acts committed during the taking of Troy, one in particular drew divine anger down on the returning fleet as a whole. Ajax the Lesser, not Ajax the great Salaminian warrior, but the smaller, faster captain from the Locrian Greeks, had seized the prophetess Cassandra, daughter of Priam, from the altar of Athena inside the city's sanctuary, violating the protection that a suppliant at a god's altar was understood to hold. Athena, in the tradition's telling, did not overlook this. The goddess, who had been among the most determined of Troy's opponents, turned her anger, and it fell not on Ajax alone, but broadly across the fleet that had not adequately punished him. Storms were sent, ships were scattered. Heroes who expected a swift homeward passage instead found themselves driven far off course, deposited on unknown shores, delayed by years. The poem known from the epic cycle as the Nostoi, the Returns, gathered these scattered homecomings into a single tradition, tracing the divergent paths of men who had fought together for a decade and now found their ways home, becoming as different from one another as their characters had always been. Odysseus led 12 ships away from Troy, the Iliad's catalog of ships, that long inventory of the Greek forces at the start of the war, places him in command of a contingent from the Ionian Islands, Ithaca, Cephallenia, Zacynthus, and Samos, a cluster of rocky western islands ruled from the smallest and most rugged of them. The island Odysseus had left a decade earlier, with his wife newly arrived and his infant son not yet walking. He had left under circumstances that, depending on which version of the tradition one follows, he had not entirely welcomed. The stories hold that he had feigned madness to avoid the draft for Troy's war, plowing a field with an ox and a donkey yoked together and sowing salt into the furrow, and that the ruse had been exposed when someone placed his infant son Telemachus in the path of the plow, and Odysseus had swerved to avoid him, proving that his mind was sound. Whether or not this particular story belongs to the oldest strands of the tradition, what the Odyssey itself makes clear is that Ithaca and everything on it had been in his thoughts throughout the war, and that the 12 ships now pulling away from the Trojan coast were pointed, in his mind, directly toward it. The fleet did not go directly toward Ithaca. The first landfall the Odyssey describes is not a mystical island beyond the edges of the known world, but a specific, nameable place, Ismarus, the city of the Cyclones, on the Thracian coast. Thrace was not the far edge of anything. It was within the general geography of the Greek world, north of the Aegean, a coast that Greek sailors knew. The raid on Ismarus was not a drift into the unknown, but a deliberate military action, the kind of opportunistic coastal raid that was, in the tradition's understanding of the period, a routine feature of maritime life. Odysseus and his men landed, attacked the city, sacked it, killed those who resisted. The Odyssey does not describe this with any particular moral weight. It was the way things went after a war, or during one, a fleet of armed men who had been fighting for 10 years, encountering a coastal settlement, and taking what they could carry. What the tradition does describe with precision is what happened next. Odysseus urged his men to take what they had taken and go. He could see, or sense, that remaining was dangerous, that a city with neighbors and allies might not remain quiet for long. His men, the Odyssey's account holds, did not listen. They had wine, they had cattle, they had taken from the town. The beach was pleasant, the evening was calm, and the logic of staying a little longer, of eating and drinking beside the fire with the sea at their backs, and the newly sacked city quiet, was a logic the men understood better than the abstract logic of moving quickly when the situation called for it. Odysseus gave the order to leave. The men stayed. There is something almost mundane about it, the gap between the leader's reading of a situation and the crew's preference for comfort and rest, a gap that would reappear throughout the voyage in different forms and at much higher cost. In the morning, the Cyclones came back. They had not been idle in the night. Inland from Ismarus, their neighbors, other Cyclones, better armed and mounted on horses, the Odyssey notes, had been gathered and brought to the coast. By daylight, the Greek camp on the beach found itself facing a force that outnumbered it substantially. men who knew the terrain and had had the night to organize themselves. The battle that followed was not a rout, but it was a loss. The Greeks fought for as long as they could hold the beach, and then the ships were launched, and the fleet pulled for the open water, and in the accounting of the day's cost, the Odyssey gives a number that is precise and unhurried. 6 men from each of Odysseus's 12 ships were left behind on the sand at Ismarus, dead on the beach of a Thracian city that no one had needed to raid, on a morning that no one had needed to spend there at all. The precision of that number, 6 per ship, 12 ships, 72 men in the arithmetic of it, gives the episode a quality that the tradition seems to have intended as instructive. The Odyssey is not, in its opening movements, a story of supernatural peril. It is a story in which things go wrong for reasons that can be named. Odysseus was ignored. The men stayed when they should have gone. A city they did not need to attack had neighbors they had not considered. The cost was specific and irreversible. The fleet that pulled away from the Thracian coast was already smaller than the fleet that had left Troy, and the voyage had not yet properly begun. The sea south of Thrace, as the fleet moved away from the Ciconian coast, held its own indifference. The wind does not distinguish between a fleet retreating from a disaster and a fleet setting out on a clear morning. The Odyssey describes a storm coming on the ships after Ismarus, not a supernatural intervention at this point in the story, just weather, the Aegean doing what the Aegean does in autumn or early spring, when the sea shifts without much warning between long calm periods and sudden driving squalls. The men hauled down the sails and rowed through it, the ships working heavily in the chop, and when the storm had passed, the fleet was still intact, still 12 ships, and the coast of Thrace was well behind them. Whatever Ithaca had looked like in the minds of these men when they left Troy, a bright particular place at the end of a manageable passage, it had already receded behind the first mistakes of the journey, and the first of the sea's reminders that nothing about the voyage home was guaranteed. There are moments in the Odyssey's early books where the narrative pauses long enough for the shape of the whole story to become briefly visible, where the poem seems to understand that it is telling not just an account of what happened, but an account of what it costs to be the kind of person who goes home when everything pushes toward staying, toward forgetting, toward accepting the comfortable or the permanent over the chosen. Odysseus at the stern of his ship after Ismarus, watching the Thracian coast disappear behind him, is not yet the wanderer who will spend 7 years on Calypso's island or 2 on Circe's. He is still within reach of the familiar world, but the voyage has already taught him something. It will go on teaching him in larger and stranger classrooms, that the distance between home and where he is tends to increase when he stops moving, and that the crew's preferences and his own are not always the same thing, and that the sea between any departure and any arrival is longer than it looks from the shore. The 12 ships, now 72 men short of their full strength, moved westward from the Thracian coast with the wind behind them. The Aegean lay between them and the Ionian islands, and the Aegean was, in the geography of the Greek world, known water, a sea with islands at reasonable intervals, with ports and headlands familiar to any sailor who had grown up among those coastlines. Under favorable conditions, the passage from Thrace to Ithaca was long but not mysterious. It was the kind of journey a capable sailor in the Bronze Age Mediterranean understood how to make. What the Odyssey establishes in these early pages is not that the supernatural begins at Ismarus. The Ciconos were ordinary human enemies, and the storm was ordinary weather, but that the capacity for error and delay begins at Ismarus. The machinery that will carry Odysseus past the edge of the known world into the country of Cyclops and Wind Kings and immortal goddesses does not require supernatural engines to start. It starts on a beach in Thrace, with a crew that was comfortable and a captain that was not listened to, and it starts quietly in the ordinary failure of men to do the thing they were told. The smoke from Troy, by the time the fleet had cleared the Thracian coast and turned toward open water, had long since faded into the distance. The city that had organized 10 years of Greek military effort was already behind them, becoming something that would be spoken of and remembered rather than looked at and inhabited. The men who had spent a decade under its walls were now sailors again, or soldiers trying to remember how to be sailors, their skills at the oar and the sail perhaps slightly rusted, their sense of the sea perhaps less sharp than it had been when they crossed the Aegean eastward in what already felt like another life. The ships were sound. The provisions they had taken at Ismarus, despite everything, were adequate. The sea ahead was open. Odysseus, the tradition makes clear, wanted to go home. This seems simple when stated plainly, but it is worth sitting with as a description of what makes him the figure the poem makes him, because the Odyssey is organized at its deepest level around this single, stubborn, repeated choice. He wanted to go home, not to a better place, not to immortality or power, or the kind of peaceful oblivion that the Lotus would later offer his men on their next stop, or the kind of divine comfort that Calypso would offer him on Ogygia. He wanted to go back to a rocky island in the Ionian Sea, to a wife who was probably being pressured to remarry, to a son who was now 19 years old and had grown up without a father, to a father who was probably old and grieving, to an island that had other men on it, now who thought they might rule it better than its absent king. The specificity of what he wanted to return to, not an idea of home, but an actual imperfect, complicated place, with actual imperfect, complicated people in it, is the thing the Odyssey returns to whenever it needs to explain why Odysseus keeps going. The fleet was 12 ships and several hundred men, and one destination that everyone on board had agreed on before they left. What the voyage would do to that agreement, and to that number, and to those ships, belonged to everything that came after Ismarus. But Ismarus is where the arithmetic of the return began its downward count, the first subtraction from the total the fleet had carried out of Troy, the first lesson in what the voyage between departure and arrival could cost. 6 men from each ship, 72 men in the full number of it, left on a Thracian beach for the sake of a night of wine and cattle that no one needed to stay for. The sea does not register these things. It moves beneath the hulls with the same weight it has always had, the same long swells coming through under the wind, the oars dipping and lifting in their rhythm, the wake spreading and smoothing behind each ship until the water shows no sign that anything has passed over it. The Thracian coast settled into the eastern horizon and then disappeared beneath it, and the fleet moved on through a morning that was, by all visible evidence, simply a morning, calm enough, clear enough, the ships making reasonable progress through water that was neither helping nor fighting them. There is a quality to the Odyssey's early geography, the Thracian coast, the storm that came after, the open Aegean ahead, that is different from the geography that follows. These are real places, or close enough to real, to be findable on a map of the ancient Greek world. Ismarus has been tentatively identified with a site on the Thracian coast. The Cicones were a historical people, mentioned in other ancient sources. The storm that hit the fleet after their departure from the coast is the kind of storm that the Aegean produces regularly. Even the arithmetic of the loss, 6 per ship, has the texture of a real accounting, rather than a mythological number shaped by symbolic weight. the Odyssey begins, in other words, in something that feels like historical, or at least geographic plausibility, and then moves steadily outward and away from it, the coastlines becoming less familiar with each episode until the fleet is navigating waters that have no equivalent on any Greek sailor's working chart. That outward movement begins with the storm. After leaving the Thracian coast, the fleet encountered weather severe enough that the Odyssey describes the ships being driven for 2 days and nights before the skies cleared and it became possible to navigate again. 2 days and nights of being pushed by a storm in the Aegean, if the winds were from the right direction, could carry a fleet a considerable distance south and west of any intended course. When the weather broke and Odysseus could see the sun and stars again, the fleet may have been further from Ithaca than when it left Ismarus, or in the wrong part of the sea entirely, or simply uncertain of its position in the way that ships driven by storms tend to be. The tradition doesn't dwell on the navigational specifics. What it establishes is that the fleet after the storm was at sea, still intact and moving, and that the next landfall would not be Thrace, and would not be anything like Thrace. The men at the oars of those 12 ships had been soldiers for 10 years. They understood orders, tactics, the logic of siege and raid, and the shifting geometry of battle. The sea was not exactly unfamiliar to them. They had crossed the Aegean to reach Troy in the first place, and many of them were islanders who had grown up with boats. But the open sea beyond familiar coastlines, the sea that offered no recognizable headland or harbor to steer toward, was a different proposition. Odysseus, at the stern of his ship, reading the swell and the wind and the stars, was doing something that required a different kind of knowledge than any the war had called on. The voyage home was not a military problem. It was a navigational one, and it was a human one. The problem of keeping a company of men moving toward a specific destination when the sea and their own natures kept offering reasons to stop. The fleet moved through the days after the storm with the oars going and the sails up when the wind cooperated and the 12 ships still in the loose formation they had kept since Troy. Each ship was its own small world, its crew, its provisions, its own small internal politics of exhaustion and hunger, and the particular tensions that build among men, kept close together on a wooden deck for weeks at a time. Odysseus was in command of his own ship, and nominally in command of the fleet as a whole, but the authority of the fleet's leader on the open sea was a more complicated thing than the authority of a general on land. He could give orders. He could not always enforce them. He could see what needed to be done. He could not always make the men do it. What the tradition understands about Odysseus, what the epithet the poem gives him, much enduring, really means when held against the texture of these early episodes, is not simply that he survived a great deal of suffering, though he did. It is that the suffering was often not the exotic supernatural kind, not the wrath of a god or the spell of a sorceress, but the ordinary grinding frustration of being the person who can see further ahead than the people around him, and who is overruled by their preference for comfort, their distrust of his judgment, their exhaustion, their very human desire to eat and drink and rest before pressing on. The war had structured that problem differently. In battle, men follow commands because the alternative to following commands is immediate and visible. On a ship crossing the Aegean, the authority of the captain is real, but the consequences of ignoring it are deferred, and deferred consequences are easier to discount. Odysseus had already learned this at Ismarus. The voyage would teach it again, in larger and stranger circumstances, more times than the fleet had ships. The 12 ships held their course westward through water that for a time was simply water, the Aegean behaving like the Aegean, the days marked by wind and rowing and the slow passage of the sky overhead. The men ate what they had from the Thracian raid, which was not nothing, and drank water from the jars stowed below the rowing benches, and slept in rotation, and watched the horizon for land. The island of Ithaca was somewhere to the west. It had always been to the west. Every stroke of the oars brought it closer in principle, even when in practice the sea complicated the calculation. The early portion of the voyage, Ismarus, the storm, the open Aegean, has a quality in the tradition of the world still being recognizable. This is the sea Greek sailors knew, or something close enough to it. The winds and the weather were divine in the tradition's understanding of the world. Poseidon and Zeus and the Anemoi, the wind gods, were actors in the meteorology of the Aegean, just as much as they were actors in the governance of Olympus. But the sea south of Thrace was not yet the sea where the laws of the familiar world ceased to operate. That sea lay ahead, and the fleet was moving toward it, though none of the men at the oars of those 12 ships yet knew they were moving toward it. The smoke of Troy had been the last fixed point. Everything that came before it, the war, the decade of effort, the deaths and the arguments and the long seasons under the city's walls, was fixed in place on the eastern horizon behind them, known and finished and unable to be changed. The journey ahead had none of that fixity. It was open, and the Aegean was wide, and the distance between where the fleet was and where it needed to be was a number that kept changing with the weather. 6 men from each ship were already not part of that calculation. The number would not stay there, but for the moment, in the days after Ismarus and the storm, the fleet was still 12 ships and still pointed west, and the oars were still working, and the men were still alive, and home was still a place that could in principle be reached. The sea in the Odyssey is almost never merely a backdrop. It is the medium through which the story moves, and it is also one of the story's agents, sometimes indifferent, sometimes actively organized by divine will, always the element that determines whether any of the distances between the islands of the wandering can be crossed at all. The 12 ships were small in it. They were always small in it, even on the calmest days, even with favorable winds and a following sea, and the oarsmen working well. The Mediterranean had no regard for what the ships were carrying or where they were trying to go. It offered the same long swells and the same unpredictable weather to every fleet that moved across it, from fishing boats to warships to the battered remnants of a 10-year campaign trying to find their way home. What the tradition holds, across the thousands of years through which this story has been told, in one form or another, is that the voyage lasted 10 years, that the gap between the departure from Troy and the return to Ithaca was exactly as long as the war that preceded it. As though the journey home cost the hero everything, the journey out had cost, and then required him to pay it again. Whether that decade is understood as a literal span of time, or as the tradition's way of shaping the story's proportions, the outward journey and the homeward one balanced against each other in the myth's deep structure, the figure carries weight. 10 years to reach a destination that the route, if nothing had intervened, might have covered in weeks. 10 years in which the crew dwindled from several hundred men in 12 ships to 1 man alone on a raft. 10 years that began, modestly and specifically, with 6 men per ship left on a beach in Thrace, because the order to leave was given and not followed. The sea off the Thracian coast settled into the distance behind the fleet. The ships moved through the late morning toward the open Aegean, the wake of each vessel braiding briefly with the ones alongside before the water smoothed and closed, and there was nothing to show where the fleet had been. The oars dipped and rose in their slow rhythm, and the men bent forward and pulled back, forward and pulled back, and the coast of Thrace continued to recede, and the smoke that had been Troy was long since gone from the sky. 6 from each ship, 72 men in the sum of it, left behind on the sand at Ismarus in the first hours of a journey that had been years in the making and would be years more in the surviving. The fleet moved on into a morning that offered nothing but sea and wind and the long western horizon, where, somewhere past the edge of the visible, the fires of Ithaca still burned on a hillside above a harbor that had not yet seen its king come home. The water was gray and calm. The oars were steady. The ships were still 12, still moving, still pointed in the right direction, with the whole long weight of everything that remained ahead of them pulling gently and persistently against the rhythm of the oars, like a tide that was not a tide, like a force that belonged less to the sea than to the shape of the story itself. Patient, unhurried, already in motion, already working its slow way toward an ending that the men at the oars could not yet see from where they sat. Odysseus had his hands cupped around his mouth, and his voice was crossing the water toward a shore he was already leaving behind. The ships were moving. The oars had been pulling for some minutes already, and the distance between the fleet and the island was real, measurable, growing with each stroke. He had done what he needed to do. He and his men were free, and beneath them in the hold of his ship was the Cyclops' ram, and the surviving men were alive, and there was open water ahead. And yet Odysseus stood at the stern and called his name back toward the cliffs, his real name, not the false name he had given inside the cave, not the careful fiction that had protected all of them through the longest night, his own name, his true name, the name of a man from Ithaca, son of Laertes. He opened his hands from his mouth, and the name went out over the sea toward the island, and the sound of it hung in the air for a moment, the way sound does over open water, carrying farther than anything thrown by hand can travel. On the cliff above the shore, the Cyclops turned his ruined face toward the sound. The name had already reached him. It settled into his understanding, the island still around him, the morning air still on his skin, his hands still bleeding where they had been cut on the pointed stake, and what Odysseus had given him in that moment of pride at the stern of a departing ship was precisely what he needed, a name to carry upward, a name specific enough to direct a prayer with accuracy. What had happened inside the cave was not an anonymous injury done by nobody, which was what Odysseus had tried to arrange. It was a named thing now. The man who had done it was named, his father was named, his island was named, and the Cyclops had all of this to offer when he knelt at the water's edge and raised his hands toward the sea. Poseidon's name is the name the whole voyage turns on. The Cyclops lifted his voice above the sound of the retreating ships, and what he prayed was not a general appeal for revenge, but something closer to a legal document, a precisely worded petition addressed to his father, the god of the sea, asking for a specific outcome in specific terms. He named Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes. He asked that if it was fated for this man to reach home, then let him arrive late. Let him arrive alone. Let him come on a foreign ship, having lost every companion he set out with, and let him find suffering waiting when he gets there. The curse was not extravagant. It did not ask for Odysseus to be destroyed. It was almost measured in its ambitions, the kind of prayer that understands what a god can and cannot grant within the existing order of things, and asks precisely for what falls within his reach. And the prayer was heard. Poseidon, one of the 12 Olympians, brother to Zeus and Hades both, holder of dominion over the sea and the seabed and the trembling deep places of the earth, was not absent, not distracted, not unaware. His realm was the thing the fleet was sitting on. His element was the medium the ships were moving through. When a Cyclops who was also his son knelt at the edge of the water and lifted a specific properly worded prayer to him across the surface of his own domain, the god received it. There is no extended scene of transmission in the tradition's account. There is only the prayer, and then the understanding that it was heard, and then everything that follows. What follows is the whole voyage. It is worth staying with the structure of the curse a moment longer, because the Odyssey builds its long architecture on those precise terms. The Cyclops asked that Odysseus arrive home late, and the poem gives him 10 years at sea, most of them not spent sailing toward anything but spinning in confusion, or held in place by forces he cannot overcome. He asked that the man arrive alone, and the poem proceeds to take every companion away from Odysseus, one by one, through disaster and disobedience, and the slow arithmetic of a journey that costs more than it gives back. He asked that Odysseus come on a foreign ship, his own vessel lost, and this too the tradition honors, because when Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca, it is not on a ship that belongs to him. And the suffering waiting at home, this too the poem has arranged, with patience over 20 years of absence and the accumulation of disorder in a house where the master has been gone so long that some have concluded he will never return. The curse is not a random punishment. It is a structured fate. Each clause of it corresponds to something the Odyssey actually delivers, and the pleasure of the tradition, for those who have time to sit with it, is watching the correspondence between what the Cyclops prayed for on the shore and what the poem eventually provides. It is less like misfortune and more like the slow completion of a contract, an agreement made between a son's prayer and a father's power, being fulfilled methodically at divine pace over years. Poseidon was not young and not impatient. The god the tradition describes was old in a particular way, old the way the sea is old, not in the sense of being worn down by time, but in the sense of having been present before most things existed, and of continuing to be present, regardless of what happens on the surface. His epithets in the tradition carry this quality: Earthshaker, the god who makes the ground move, who reminds every standing thing that it stands on something alive. Horse Lord, a title that reaches back to the earliest layers of Greek religious practice, to a god worshipped with horses before the sea became the dominant element of his identity. These are the names of a figure whose power is not spectacular in the way fire is spectacular, but elemental in the way soil is elemental, present in the structure of things, rather than burning across the surface of them. He had a son who was a Cyclops, and that son had a grievance, and the sea was Poseidon's own body through which the fleet of Odysseus was now moving. The relationship between Polyphemus and Poseidon matters to the structure of the tradition, because it establishes that the injury done in the cave was not merely personal, but relational, a wrong done to a figure who could legitimately appeal to divine authority for redress. Polyphemus is named in the tradition as the son of Poseidon and the sea nymph Thoosa, who was herself the daughter of Phorcys, a sea deity older even than the Olympians in some accounts, a figure of the deep water and the things that live in it without names that humans know. This gives Polyphemus a heritage that is partly monstrous and partly divine, and it means that when Odysseus blinded him and mocked him and sailed away calling his true name back across the water, he was not simply escaping from a dangerous creature. He was injuring the son of a god who ruled the element he was trying to cross. The tradition understands this clearly. The poem opens not with Troy, not with the blinding, not with any moment of the wanderings, but with a divine council already in progress, Zeus and the assembled Olympians gathered at a point when Odysseus has been held on the island of Calypso for years, when the only thing preventing his return is the active opposition of Poseidon. Athena speaks on Odysseus's behalf. She makes her case to Zeus, and Zeus agrees that the man has been held long enough, and that the time has come to arrange the homeward motion. The mechanism is ready. The plan is made. The one difficulty is that Poseidon is not at the council when these decisions are reached. He is at a feast among the Ethiopians at the far edge of the world, and the poem uses his momentary absence to set the homeward machinery in motion before he returns to find it already running. This is one of the quietly interesting things about how the Odyssey handles the relationship between fate and divine power. Odysseus is fated to return home. The tradition establishes this as a fixed thing. The gods know it, the poem knows it, the audience eventually understands it. Poseidon cannot simply prevent the return from happening, because fate does not permit him to. But working within that constraint, he has considerable room. He cannot kill Odysseus outright. He can do almost everything short of that. Drive him onto rocks, destroy his ships, strand him on islands, take years of his life on the water, ensure that every time the return seems close, it is pulled back farther. The constraint of fate does not reduce Poseidon's presence in the poem. In a strange way, it makes it more interesting. A god operating within limits reveals the shape of those limits, and the shape of the limits in the Odyssey is the shape of the voyage itself. The homeward journey of Odysseus is, among other things, a demonstration of how much damage a god can do within the specific boundaries of what he cannot do. There is a divine council at the opening of the poem, and Poseidon is absent from it, and that absence is the narrow opening through which the return begins to move. The Olympian order arranges itself around the moment of his absence, the way water finds a gap. Athena speaks while there is still time to speak. The message is sent to Calypso. The raft is built. The motion begins. And by the time Poseidon returns from his feast among the Ethiopians and takes his place once more in the divine order of things, the motion is already underway, and the broad arc of what is fated has already begun bending slowly toward the shore of Ithaca. He sees Odysseus on the raft, out on the open water, moving, and the Odyssey makes no effort to suggest that Poseidon accepts this calmly. He does not accept it calmly. He raises a storm, not the first storm he has raised against this man, and not the last thing he does to the raft and the man aboard it before Odysseus eventually reaches shore. But he is working within the framework. The fatal outcome is not available to him. What is available is everything on the way to it. The Polyphemus episode itself is worth holding in mind for a moment longer, because the tradition describes it as occurring near what the Odyssey calls the beginning of the wanderings, one of the first major encounters after the relatively grounded catastrophe at Ismarus, when the Thracian Ciconi drove the fleet back to sea with losses. The Cyclops' island followed in sequence, and it is in that cave that the voyage's primary divine engine is set in motion. Everything before the island is part of the story, but it is in the cave that the structure is locked. The tradition describes Polyphemus in terms that make him something genuinely different from the world Odysseus came from. He does not farm. He does not sail. He has no assembly, no common law, no communal governance of any kind. Each Cyclops lives in his cave by his own rules, ruling his own household, and whatever happens to the others is simply not his concern. The island around him is rich. The tradition notes wild vines and grain and lush meadows, an abundance the Cyclops do not cultivate because the earth simply provides it without being asked. The cave itself is organized in its own way: sorted pens of young animals, racks of drying cheese, pails of whey, a central hearth. But this is pastoral order, the order of a single enormous creature who tends his animals and sleeps and eats and has never had a reason to think about the rest of the world. Into this life, Odysseus arrived uninvited with 12 men and helped himself to what he found. The false name Audus, meaning nobody, is one of the most precisely designed pieces of the whole episode, and it works in two registers at once. On the level of practical deception, it is the thing that saves the surviving crew. When Polyphemus, blinded and in agony, shouts to the neighboring Cyclopes that somebody is hurting him, he tells them nobody is killing him, nobody is his enemy. And the neighbors, hearing this, conclude that the god has sent him an illness, and there is nothing to be done about divine illness, but pray, and they return to their caves and leave him alone. The name works. It works exactly as Odysseus planned. But the false name also creates the problem that the real name then solves. From Polyphemus's point of view, the prayer requires specificity. A Cyclops standing at the shoreline, praying against nobody, would be praying against nothing at all. The moment Odysseus called his real name across the water, he gave his enemy the tool the enemy needed, and everything the false name had prevented became possible again. This is what the tradition seems to find most interesting about Odysseus's decision to shout from the ship. It was not ignorance. He knew his name would carry across the water. He knew Polyphemus would hear it. His men on the ship understood the risk and urged him to stop. The poem records their alarm, their pleading, the second call of the real name, going out over the sea, despite everything they said. The tradition offers various ways of understanding what moved Odysseus in that moment. Pride is the obvious reading, the need to be known as the author of an act so clever, to let the enemy understand who had outwitted him. A kind of self-identification so deep it overcomes even self-preservation. The island is behind him, the oars are pulling, the ship is moving, and still he needs the Cyclops to know his name. What the Cyclops does with that name, the tradition has already explained. He kneels at the water's edge, and his hands go up, and he speaks to his father with the precision of someone who has been waiting to speak and now has everything he needs to say. The prayer goes down into the water and through it, into the domain of Poseidon, into whatever register divine hearing operates on. The words are specific. Late, alone, on a foreign ship, all companions lost, suffering at home. These are not vague wishes, they are conditions. And the god who receives them has the sea to work with. All the sea, everywhere, beneath every ship Odysseus will ever sail on. Poseidon beneath the surface of the Aegean is not a dramatic image in the tradition. He does not rise from the water with a trident raised. He does not call storms down from where the clouds are. He simply moves through deep water with the unhurried quality of something that has always been in motion and is in no particular hurry to reach any one place. The sea above him carries 12 small ships westward. One of those ships carries a man whose real name the god now has from a credible source. The terms of what is owed have been established. The method of payment will take years. There is something almost structural about this, the way the Odyssey sets its divine enmity up, not as a thing that descends suddenly on Odysseus from outside, but as a thing already woven into the water around him, already present in the medium he has to cross to get where he is going. He does not know, sailing away from the Cyclops' island, the exact terms of what has been prayed against him, but the tradition's audience does. because the poem has arranged its telling so that the curse is heard before its effects are felt, the way a note is struck before its sound has traveled across the room. The opposition of Poseidon is not the only divine force at work in the wanderings, and the tradition is careful to establish this. Athena exists alongside Poseidon's enmity as a continuous counterweight, not always able to act directly, not always present, but oriented toward Odysseus's survival and homecoming in a way that shapes the limits within which Poseidon works. She is his advocate at the divine council. She appears to his son on Ithaca. She reaches him on certain shores. The poem describes the two of them, goddess and mortal, as having a particular relationship based in mutual recognition of a specific quality, the taste for practical intelligence over direct force, the pleasure of a problem solved by indirection rather than power. But it is Poseidon who structures the voyage's duration and shape. Athena works toward the end point. Poseidon extends the distance between the start and the end. The poem is built in the space between them. What the divine frame of the Odyssey provides, taken whole, is a world in which human choices and divine intentions are interlocked without either being fully in control of the other. Odysseus's choice to shout his name was his own. No god made him do it. The consequences of that choice enter the domain of Poseidon and are amplified by divine power, far beyond what any human choice on its own could generate. The blinding was Odysseus's act. The prayer was Polyphemus's act. The curse was Poseidon's response. And the voyage that follows is the space where all three meet and continue meeting over 10 years of sea. The tradition does not frame this as unfair. There is no suggestion that the curse overreaches, that Poseidon is unreasonable, that Odysseus's suffering is disproportionate to what he did. The prayer is granted because the prayer was properly made by a legitimate petitioner to a god with authority over the relevant domain. The mechanism is working as it is supposed to work. Divine enmity, in the world the Odyssey describes, is a structural feature of how things go, as much a part of the cosmos as the sea itself, as much a part of a long voyage as the wind. Poseidon is patient in a way that gods in this tradition generally are. He does not exhaust himself in a single catastrophe and withdraw. He is the sea. The sea is simply there. Every time Odysseus is on it, the condition of Poseidon's opposition is active. Every storm at sea is at minimum consistent with that opposition, even when the poem does not specify the god's involvement directly. The wanderings take years, partly because of specific decisions made by Odysseus and his crew, a delay here, a theft there, a disobedience that costs the remaining ships or the remaining men. But they also take years, because crossing a sea whose god is waiting for you to make a mistake is not something that goes quickly. The Cyclops prayed for late. The god granted late, and late turns out to mean 10 years. The terms of the curse, laid out in that precise petition at the waterline, function in the narrative something like waypoints on a long route, not a map of specific events, but a set of conditions that the voyage must satisfy before it can be called complete. The prayer has named its destination, Odysseus arriving at Ithaca alone, on a foreign ship, without a single companion from the 12 ships that left Troy with him. This is where the curse ends, and where the story it generates can rest. Until those conditions are met, the voyage continues. Until those conditions are met, the sea remains Poseidon's body, and Odysseus remains inside it. The Odyssey knows, from its opening lines, that the conditions will eventually be met. It says so clearly, the man will return home. This is not a spoiler, but a structural fact the poem relies on. The interest is not in whether but in how, not in the destination, but in the full, textured, sometimes maddening distance between the departure and the arrival, and what structures that distance, beneath the human decisions and the specific adventures and the named islands, is Poseidon. His opposition is the shape of the space the hero moves through. His curse is the dimensions of the container. Sitting with this, the enormous patience of it, the slow maritime time of a god who has no reason to hurry, it becomes easier to understand why the Odyssey is organized the way it is. It is not a poem about a man rushing home. It is a poem about a man trying to cross a space that keeps reconstituting itself ahead of him. And what keeps reconstituting it, what keeps adding distance and delay and loss, is the thing moving quietly through the deep water beneath every ship he sails on, unhurried, working within the limits of what fate permits, and finding within those limits more than enough room. The name Odysseus called across the water on the morning of his departure from the Cyclops' island carried all of this. The fleet was already moving, the island was already diminishing behind them. The oars were doing what oars do, and the sea was accepting the weight of the ships the way it always does, evenly, continuously, without preference. And somewhere below that surface, in water too deep for any afternoon light to reach, in the patient dark of a god's domain, the prayer had already arrived. The terms were clear. The god had received them. The voyage would continue for exactly as long as the curse required, and the sea would be exactly what the sea had always been, present beneath every ship, attending without impatience, moving with the long rhythms of something that does not experience duration, the way the man at the stern does, that does not watch the horizon ahead and wish it would come closer. Poseidon was already there. He was the water the ships were sitting on. He was the depth beneath the hulls, the current under the keels, the dark beneath the surface that the ships pressed down against, and could not feel except as buoyancy. The fleet moved westward above him, 12 ships that had once been 12, and were now fewer than that, their sails catching whatever wind was available, their crews watching the horizon for the next shore. And beneath them the sea continued its long, indifferent, attentive movement, broad and cold and impossibly old, carrying them toward everything the curse had specified, with no sense of urgency at all. The prayer had been made, the name had been given, the god had it now, and the sea was the god's, and the sea was everywhere between Troy and Ithaca, filling all the space between the world Odysseus had come from and the home he was trying to reach. Somewhere in that space the fleet moved. Somewhere in that dark below the fleet, Poseidon moved too. Not following, not chasing, something quieter than that, and much harder to escape, simply present, patient, already there in the water ahead, waiting in the water at either side, and filling the cold distance beneath every hull with the unhurried weight of what had already been prayed, and what had already been heard, and what was already, in the slow language of a divine curse, beginning to be answered. The cave was dark when Odysseus and his men first stepped inside it. Polyphemus was not there. He had taken his flocks out to the mountain pastures at first light, as he did each morning, and the cave stood open and unguarded in the middle of the day, the entrance high enough for a man to walk through without ducking, the interior stretching back into shadow, and the particular warm smell of animals kept in a confined space over a long time. Odysseus and his men moved through it slowly, eyes adjusting, taking in what they found. The racks came into focus first. The cheese rounds stacked and drying on frames of woven reed, dozens of them arranged in rows, each one pressed and shaped with the careful deliberateness of someone who had made cheese many times before and knew exactly how it should be done. Along one wall walked the lamb pens, lambs, and kids sorted by age, the youngest together, the older ones in a separate enclosure, the arrangement suggesting a mind that kept things ordered, that separated what belonged in different categories, and returned each evening to check that the sorting remained correct. Pails of whey stood near the milking pens, still fresh enough that the smell of it carried across the whole space. In the center of the cave, a stone hearth held ash from a recent fire, and the firewood stacked against the far wall was enough to suggest that the figure who lived here moved heavy loads without effort. The men looked at the racks and the pens and the pails and saw an inventory. They wanted to take the cheese and drive a selection of the lambs down to the ships and leave before evening, before the cave's owner returned. This was the sensible course. The cave was rich and unguarded, and the sea was a short walk away. Odysseus heard the argument and understood it completely. He chose instead to stay. The tradition does not frame this as a simple act of foolishness. The Odyssey holds it as curiosity, a desire to see what kind of creature kept this particular household, what the meeting would produce, whether there might be hospitality in it. Odysseus was a man who moved through the world by making calculations, and his calculations on the threshold of that cave were different from his men's. His men were calculating the cheese. Odysseus was calculating something harder to name, the interest of the encounter itself, the knowledge that would come from it, the story that might be made. Whatever the reason, they stayed. Polyphemus came home in the evening. He came through the entrance carrying an enormous load of firewood, gathered from the mountain slopes, carrying it the way someone might carry a bundle of rushes, tucked under one arm, barely considered, and when he threw it down from his shoulder, the crash of it hit the stone floor of the cave and echoed off the walls and sent the men scrambling backward into the shadows against the far rock. The sound was different in scale from any sound wood normally makes when it falls. The entrance went dark for a moment as he moved through it, and then the firelight came back, and he was inside. He was large enough that the space of the cave felt diminished by his presence. Not full. The cave was genuinely enormous, the kind of interior that takes the eye some time to find the far wall, but diminished in the way that a familiar room can feel smaller when something unexpectedly large is placed inside it. He moved to the pen along one wall and brought in the female sheep for milking, leaving the rams outside in the yard he had enclosed with boulders, and he worked through the milking with the same systematic thoroughness that the sorted lamb pens had already suggested, each animal in sequence, each pail filled, the work of someone who had done this 10,000 evenings in a row. Then he lit the fire. The kindling caught, and the cave filled with orange light, and the light reached into the corners where Odysseus and his men had pressed themselves against the rock, and Polyphemus saw them. The tradition describes his single eye as large. In the firelight of that cave, with the shadows jumping on the walls above the stacked cheese racks, and the lamb pens, and the pails of whey, the eye caught the light and held it, and Odysseus stood and spoke first, which was, at that moment, the only thing to do. Polyphemus asked who they were, and where they had come from, and Odysseus answered carefully, invoking the laws of hospitality, the protection of Zeus, who watched over guests and suppliants, asking for the welcome that tradition held, a host owed to travelers arriving at his door. He gave his ship's location as unknown to him, in the way a man gives away nothing that can be used against him, while appearing to give everything freely. The Cyclops' answer was to say that the Cyclops did not concern themselves with Zeus. They were stronger than the gods, he said, and felt no particular obligation to the framework Zeus maintained. He asked again, more directly, where the ships were. Odysseus said Poseidon had wrecked them. The ships were gone. He offered nothing more specific than that. Polyphemus took 2 of the men, then, with no ceremony at all, reached into the shadows where they stood and took 2 of them, and that was the end of those 2 men, and the others could do nothing except stand in the cave and watch and understand exactly what they were looking at. Polyphemus ate and slept, and in the morning took 2 more and rolled the enormous stone that served as his door into the entrance of the cave before he left with his flocks, blocking the opening completely, and the men were inside in the half-dark, left with the cheese and the lambs and the problem of the stone. The stone was the problem. Odysseus had thought, in the night of his sword, of simply killing Polyphemus while he slept. The thought was there, and then it was not, because the sword was useless. The stone door could only be moved from outside, or by something with the strength to move it from inside, and Odysseus and all his remaining men together could not move it. Killing Polyphemus would have sealed them inside the cave permanently, with a dead giant between them and the world. Odysseus was the kind of man who thought a problem through to its second and third consequence before he moved, and what he needed was not a way to end the threat, but a way to end it and still get out. He found the olive stake on the second day. It was a length of green olive wood, the trunk of a young tree that Polyphemus had cut and left inside the cave to dry, perhaps for use as a walking staff, perhaps for some other purpose the Cyclops had in mind that would never now be realized. Odysseus cut a length from it, working quietly while Polyphemus was away with the flocks, and sharpened one end to a point with his knife, working the blade in long, careful strokes until the tip was drawn fine. Then he pushed the sharpened end into the embers of the hearth and held it there until the wood was hardened all the way through to the center of the point, the way a craftsman treats a tool before it is used for the first time. He hid it under the deep dung that lay heaped along the cave walls, and he waited. The wine was a separate piece of the plan, the piece that made everything else possible. Odysseus had carried it from the ship, a gift from Marin, a priest of Apollo at Ismarus, given in thanks when Odysseus had protected his household during the raid there. It was a dark wine, very strong, unmixed, the kind of wine that was normally diluted with water before drinking, and even then consumed carefully. Marin had given it in a silver-studded jar, and warned that it was powerful. Odysseus had kept it, and brought it with him into the cave. And on the evening of the third day, when Polyphemus had eaten and sat back from his meal, Odysseus approached him with a bowl of it, and offered it with the same careful courtesy he had offered on the first night, the language of hospitality, the frame of a guest presenting something to his host. Polyphemus drank it in one swallow. He had never tasted wine like it. He asked for more, and asked for Odysseus's name, and his voice had changed, flattened slightly, opened, and Odysseus poured a second bowl and a third, and between the second and the third he gave the answer to the question about his name. The name he gave was Odysseus. In the Greek that the Odyssey was composed in, Odysseus means nobody. It means the absence of a person where a person might otherwise be, the shape of a name without a name inside it, a sound that functions grammatically as a designation while designating nothing specific. Odysseus had been carrying this answer since before he entered the cave. It was the kind of thing he prepared, not a retreat, but a move made in advance, placed where it would be needed before the need for it was known. Polyphemus heard the name and said that nobody would be eaten last, as a gift. It was a coarse joke, or an honest one, The Cyclops did not seem to distinguish between those categories. He drank the third bowl and lay back, and his breathing slowed and deepened into the long, complete, entirely reliable sleep of something very large that has consumed more wine than it understood it was consuming. The fire had burned down to embers. The cave was quiet, except for the animals in their pens, who moved occasionally and were still. Odysseus brought the stake out from under the dung. He placed the sharpened end back in the embers until the tip glowed. Then he gathered 4 of his men, the 4 he had chosen for this, who knew what was coming, and together they lifted it. The Odyssey describes what happened next without dwelling on it. The stake was driven forward. Polyphemus woke screaming. The other Cyclopes came to the entrance of the cave from their own caves on the hillside. Drawn by the sound, they called through the stone door, asking what was wrong, asking whether someone was hurting him. From inside the cave, Polyphemus answered, "Nobody is hurting me," he said. "Nobody is killing me by tricks." The Cyclopes outside heard the answer. Nobody was hurting him. If nobody was hurting him, then he was sick or going mad, and those were matters between Polyphemus and his father Poseidon, and there was nothing for neighbors to do about that. They told him to pray to his father, and went back to their own caves in the night, and the plan that had been built around a single word, the plan that existed inside the word autes, like a ship folded inside a bottle, unfolded exactly as Odysseus had prepared it to, and the Cyclopes were gone. Polyphemus rolled the stone door aside in the morning, as he always did, to let his flocks out to pasture. He sat in the entrance as they filed past him, running his hands along the back of each animal to make sure none of the men rode out on top of them, his hands moving carefully and systematically over every animal that passed. The rams went out with the flocks each morning too, which they did not normally do. They stayed in the cave overnight, always, but this morning every ram moved toward the entrance with the ewes, and even this, which was strange, Polyphemus noticed and spoke to, addressing the largest ram in the flock directly, asking it why it moved so slowly today, whether it was troubled by what had happened to its master. Odysseus was underneath that ram. He had locked his fingers in the deep wool of the animal's belly and held himself there, suspended above the ground, his face turned upward into the fleece that smelled of lanolin and old grass, and the particular animal warmth of something that had been sleeping on stone in an enclosed space all night. The ram moved forward, slowly, toward the entrance, and the blind hand swept across its back and did not reach beneath. And then Odysseus was through the entrance and into the cold gray morning air with the sound of the sea below and the smell of the outside world coming in from every direction at once. He released the ram and ran. The other men had come out beneath other animals, each one moving carefully and quickly down the slope toward the shore. Odysseus was the last through the entrance, under the largest ram, and he ran after the men who were already moving the lambs they had driven from the cave down to the water, already pushing the ship back from the shore, already working the oars. He ran and did not look back until he was at the water, and then he looked back once. The ship was moving by the time everything is accounted for, the animals loaded, the men at the oars, the distance beginning to open between the hull and the shore. The island had a rocky upper slope above the cave entrance, and Polyphemus had come out there somehow, following the sound of the ship, his ruined face turned down toward the noise of the water. He was enormous on the skyline. He tore a section of cliff away with his hands and threw it toward the sound. The Odyssey's geography is precise about what happened when the boulder landed. It fell ahead of the bow, and the wave it made pushed the ship back toward shore, And Odysseus's men took up the oars hard and drove the ship out again, and the men were calling to him, not to speak, not to give himself away, to stay quiet and let the distance grow. The tradition holds that the desire to be known overcame the judgment that counseled silence. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called back across the water, and what he called was his own name, his real name, not nobody. His own name, with his father's name and his island's name attached to it, the full designation that would allow a prayer to reach its target. Odysseus, son of Lartus, of Ithaca, the name a god would need to know. The ship was pulling steadily away. The Thracian coast was receding. The cave mouth was a dark opening in the cliff face above the shore, and Polyphemus was somewhere up there on the rocks, and his voice was carrying back across the water, and what his voice carried was the curse already taking its shape. The ancient tradition of placing the Cyclops' island at a specific location on the Greek world's map was strong enough that various ancient writers felt compelled to anchor it. Sicily was the most persistent candidate, with its volcanic landscape and the bulk of Mount Etna rising from the island's interior, the mountain associated in other traditions with the forges of Hephaestus and the bodies of giants buried beneath. The violence of the landscape, the steam vents and lava fields, the sense of enormous underground forces operating just below the visible surface, these made it plausible to someone wanting a physical location for a physical cave. The city of Catania, near Etna's base, had traditions about the Cyclops that its inhabitants were willing to describe. The Odyssey is less interested in this kind of placing. The wanderings are designed to operate at a distance from the known world, not in waters the audience could navigate themselves, not on shores that appeared on any practical itinerary, but in a space that lies past the edge of the familiar, where the normal rules of geography and proportion and hospitable dealing among humans have all been suspended. A Cyclops who fitted the proportions of Sicily would have to be implausibly large even for Sicily. A cave that could hold hundreds of sheep and a dozen men and a giant and still have room for sorting racks and milking pens and stacked firewood would have to be implausibly large for any real mountain. The tradition is not describing a real cave on a real island. It is describing an encounter that takes place in the specific part of the world that Odysseus inhabits during his wanderings, a world where things are larger than they should be and stranger than they should be, and where the rules that govern life among known humans do not apply in the way a traveler would expect them to. The cave is exactly as large as the episode inside it requires. The Cyclops is exactly as large as the plan that defeats him requires, large enough to be genuinely dangerous, not so large that any plan at all could work. The wine is exactly as strong as the timing requires. The stake is exactly as available as the escape requires. The tradition has shaped these elements over a very long time into a form where each piece fits the others with the precision of things that have been handled and adjusted and refined across many tellings until the proportions are exactly right. The detail of the cheese racks is not incidental. Neither is the sorting of the lambs by age. These details establish that Polyphemus is not simply a monster, not simply a large thing that eats people because it has no other function in the story. He is something stranger and more interesting than that, a figure who maintains a careful, organized domestic life entirely removed from any human framework of exchange or obligation. He makes cheese. He sorts his animals. He milks in the evening. He has named his largest ram and speaks to it directly with something that functions like affection. None of these things belong to a creature whose only role is obstacle. They belong to something that exists in its own complete world, by its own complete set of rules. the way the tradition held that the Cyclopes had always lived, without civic assembly, without agriculture, without ships, each one ruling his own household, on his own mountain, with no interest in what any other household was doing. Odysseus enters that world with the full apparatus of Greek civilization behind him, the concept of guest friendship, the belief that Zeus observed its violation, the habit of calculating consequences, the use of language as a tool for concealment, as well as communication. The cave is a meeting of two completely different frameworks for being in the world, and the one that survives is the one that can think faster and lie more precisely, not the larger or more powerful one. The word outis is worth sitting with a moment longer than the plot requires. It is the simplest deception in the poem, and also the most compressed. Odysseus chose a name that functions as a name grammatically, while functioning as a refusal of identification semantically, a name that holds the grammar of a person while replacing the content with absence. When Polyphemus said it to the other Cyclopes, he was telling the truth. Nobody had done this to him. The sentence was accurate and useless at the same time, and the difference between those two things, between a sentence being accurate and a sentence being useful, is a gap that Odysseus had built his entire escape plan inside. The Odyssey returns to this again and again in different forms, the space between what a word appears to mean and what it actually does, between what is declared and what is concealed, between the surface of a statement and the function it performs. A man who could think of that name in that cave, while his companions were being eaten and the stone was across the door, was a particular kind of man. The tradition knew exactly what kind it was describing. The morning of the escape holds something worth noticing in its texture. The way the episode closes, not with triumph, but with a slow, quiet, slightly uncertain movement through an ordinary pastoral scene. The sheep filed out through the entrance in the gray dawn light. Enormous animals, each one moving through the opening with the unhurried regularity of a flock that has made this same movement every morning for years, because it has, because the morning release of the flock was the one fixed, reliable event of the day in Polyphemus's routine, the one thing that could be counted on to happen, regardless of what had occurred the night before. The flock moved because the flock always moved at this hour. Polyphemus sat in the entrance and ran his hands along the backs of the animals because he always did that, the way any thorough keeper of animals would check a flock leaving a pen. His method was careful, and the men were not above it. The largest ram moved last and slowest, and the man holding on beneath it was the one who had planned all of this, who was now reduced to counting on the ram's pace, and the blind hands moving across its back, and the few inches of animal above him that separated him from everything that had happened inside the cave. The wool smelled of the cave. The cold air came in from outside. The hands moved across the fleece and did not reach beneath. The ram stepped through the entrance and down the slope, and the morning was there, and the sea was there, and the ships were below. The ship moved off the island's shore in the early morning, the oars working steadily. The men who had come out beneath the sheep, now pulling at the benches, the lambs from the cave penned in the hold, the island receding behind the stern. The cave mouth was visible for a while as the distance increased, a dark, irregular opening in the gray cliff face, sitting in the rock above the shore the way caves do, open and inert, showing nothing of what had happened inside it. The flock would still be moving up the mountain slopes. The cheese would still be drying on its racks. The lamb pens, empty of their youngest animals now, would still hold the sorting that had been done the day before. Everything in the cave that could persist was persisting without interruption. The ship pulled steadily away from the island, its bow aimed across open water, the early light beginning to separate the sea's surface from the sky above it, the horizon becoming a definite line where there had been only a gradation of gray. The sound of the oars was steady, and the sea was calm, and the island was getting smaller with every stroke. There is something characteristic about the way the episode ends in the tradition. The calling back, the name given across the water, the distance not yet large enough to make the pride dangerous. The Odyssey is precise about the order of events, the men urging silence, Odysseus calling once, the first boulder thrown, the wave pushing the ship back, the men rowing harder, a second call louder than the first, the second boulder thrown, the wave this time pushing the ship forward and nearer the far shore. The structure of it has the quality of something told many times in the same way, the escalation repeated, the pattern of warning and refusal given twice, so that its completeness is established, so that the listener understands that the choice was made not once in a moment of weakness, but twice, with the consequences of the first call already visible. The men at the oars were pulling toward open water. The cave was behind them and growing smaller. The sun was beginning to come up from somewhere below the horizon, the sky lightening from below, in the way it does very early on, a clear morning at sea, the color arriving slowly and then more quickly as the angle increases. The sound of the sheep on the slopes above had faded as the ship moved out, the ordinary bleating of a flock on a hillside becoming inaudible under the sound of oars and water and wind. The island had looked from the sea the day before like any island, rocky shores, pasture on the slopes, trees above the cave line, nothing in its appearance from a distance that indicated what was kept inside those caves. The Odyssey describes the smaller island just off its coast where the fleet had anchored the night before the visit, a green, uninhabited place with wild goats and good water, a natural harbor, the kind of anchorage that any careful captain would choose when uncertain of what lay on the larger island nearby. The fleet had spent the night there, and in the morning Odysseus had taken one ship across to the larger island to investigate, and the investigation had lasted 3 days. 3 days, and a handful of the men who had entered that cave with him were not in the ship, pulling away from it now. The tradition holds the number of the dead with the same undemonstrative precision. It holds all its arithmetic, naming them not by name, but by what happened to them, placing them in the sequence of the story where they belong. The cave is closing behind the ship now. The dark opening in the cliff face is becoming part of the general cliff, indistinct from the rock around it, the distance making it smaller and more ordinary with every stroke of the oars. The island itself is becoming a shape rather than a place. The oars moved in their rhythm. The water ran back from the hull in 2 lines, churned white at the blades, and then smoothing quickly to the level surface it had been before. The sky continued to lighten. The distance between the ship and the island's shore continued to grow, each stroke adding to it, the accumulated progress of all the strokes before it, already a significant number of lengths of open water. The cave mouth in the cliff face was small now, and darker than the rock around it, the way any opening in a light-colored surface appears darker as the angle decreases and the interior disappears. It held its shape. It would hold its shape through the morning and into the afternoon, and through all the afternoons after this one, the sheep returning at evening to be sorted and milked, the fire lit, the stone rolled into the entrance. The interior of the cave would not change. The cheese racks and the lamb pens and the pails and the hearth and the hide of the largest ram, whose name Polyphemus had spoken aloud into the morning air as it moved slow and heavy through the entrance. all of that would continue to exist inside the cave, the way the contents of any place continue to exist after the people who passed through it have moved on. The ship pulled steadily away, its bow ahead of it, the water ahead of it, empty all the way to the horizon. The island fell behind. The cave mouth, if it was still visible, was too small now to distinguish from the general texture of the cliff, the gray rock and shadow that all cliffs are from a sufficient distance. The opening that had been specific and present now absorbed back into the general shape of a distant shore. The island receded. The sea opened ahead of the bow. The oars moved in their steady sequence. The morning continued to arrive. The silver cord came undone in the dark. Odysseus was asleep at the stern of his ship, the first sleep he had allowed himself in many days, and the crew had been watching the bag of winds since Aeolus had handed it over on his floating island, a bag of oxhide bound so tightly and so carefully that none of them had been told what it contained. What it contained was everything that could go wrong with the sea. Aeolus had gathered the opposing winds, the north wind, the south wind, the east wind, and sealed them inside the leather with a cord of bright silver, leaving only the west wind free to carry the fleet homeward. For 9 days and 9 nights, Odysseus had not slept, standing at the helm himself, watching the water, keeping the ships on course. And on the 10th day, with Ithaca's fires visible on the horizon at night, the shapes of the hills he knew appearing in the dark, like something almost remembered, he had finally let himself close his eyes. The crew spoke to one another quietly at the bow. They had been watching the bag. Some of them believed it held gold and silver, a gift from Aeolus too generous to share. They pulled the silver cord loose between them, and the mouth of the bag opened, and everything held inside it rushed out at once. The sea rose. The winds came in from every direction, meeting above the fleet and driving it eastward, the sails straining and then tearing, the ships losing their course in a matter of moments. Odysseus woke to a sea that was nothing like the one he had fallen asleep beside. He woke to a fleet in chaos, and to the recognition that the fires of Ithaca were gone from the horizon, replaced by open water in every direction, the night giving nothing back. The tradition holds that he considered, in that moment, whether to go over the side, whether simply stepping off the ship into that driven sea might be the easier answer. The thought passed. He stayed on board. The fleet drove before the winds all the way back to Aeolia, the floating island, the harbor of rocks and bronze walls, retracing in hours a voyage that had taken 9 days. Aeolus would not help a second time. He told Odysseus to go, and the tone of the tradition at that moment is not angry but final. A man who had given everything he could give and found the gift wasted, not through malice, but through the ordinary failure of tired men who had been watching something they did not fully understand for too many days. Odysseus took his fleet back out to sea without wind, and the men bent to the oars, rowing away from the one island that might have sent them home. The land of the Lotus Eaters had come before all of this, in the sequence of the wanderings, though its texture is among the quietest of the Voyage's episodes. 3 scouts went inland from the ships to discover what manner of people lived there. The people they found were not hostile. They offered the scouts the lotus plant, which the local inhabitants ate themselves, and the scouts ate it and forgot, not in the way sleep makes a person forget, where the memory is simply absent for a while and returns on waking, but in the way a body forgets pain after long enough away from it, a forgetting that became its own kind of fullness, so that there was no gap remaining in which the desire to leave could take hold. The scouts wanted nothing after eating the lotus. They did not want to go back to the ships. They did not want to see Ithaca or their families or the lives they had lived before the war. What they wanted was to remain exactly where they were, in a warm and uneventful contentment that required nothing from them at all. Odysseus went inland himself and found them there and dragged them back to the ships. The tradition is specific about the dragging. They wept as they were brought down to the beach, pulling against him, not in anger, but in the slow resistance of people being taken from something they have settled into completely. He ordered the fleet to sea immediately, before anyone else could go ashore and eat. The Lotus Eaters themselves are not described as malevolent. The island is not a trap in the way some of the later islands are traps. It is simply a place where a particular forgetting is available, and where the journey would have ended if Odysseus had allowed it to. The episode carries at its edges a question that the tradition does not fully answer about what it costs to keep going, and what kind of man keeps going, and what exactly he is holding on to when he drags his weeping men back to the ships and orders the oars into the water. After the Lastrygonians, after the 11 ships lost in the perfect harbor, the boulders falling from the cliffs, the men in the water, after all of that was behind him, and his single remaining ship had rowed clear, and he had cut the mooring rope and pulled away from the harbor entrance, leaving 11 ships behind where 12 had arrived, Odysseus came at last to the island of Aiaia. Aiaia was where Circe lived. The Odyssey identifies her as a daughter of Helios, the sun and the sister of Aeetes, who held the golden fleece in Colchis at the edge of the world, a lineage that placed her at a very particular distance from the ordinary, within a family of figures who existed at the border between the divine and something older and stranger than divinity. She was a goddess with knowledge of herbs and transformation. She lived in a stone hall in the center of the island, surrounded by wolves and lions that had once been men, that she had transformed, and that now moved around her house with the affectionate docility of very large dogs. The scouting party Odysseus sent inland found the hall and the animals, and Circe singing inside at her loom, and most of them went in. Eurylochus stayed outside, unwilling, which is why there was a survivor to go back to the ships and tell Odysseus what had happened. What happened was that Circe fed the men and gave them something to drink, and mixed into what she gave them was something that made them forget their homes. Then she touched them with her wand, and they became pigs, still themselves inside, the tradition specifies, their minds unchanged, their feelings intact, only their bodies altered, and she drove them into the sty. Odysseus went inland alone to find them. On the road through the forest, Hermes met him in the form of a young man, carrying the caduceus, the herald's wand, and gave him the herb moly, a plant with a black root and a white flower that the tradition describes as difficult for mortal men to dig, though the gods can manage it, and told him exactly what to do. Odysseus went to the hall. Circe gave him the drink. The moly held the transformation back. He drew his sword, and the tradition describes the moment that followed with an interesting kind of care, not as a confrontation, but as a negotiation. Circe recognizing in his resistance the shape of something she had been told would come. She restored the men. She asked Odysseus to stay. They stayed for a year. The tradition presents this plainly, without apology, as a year in which the men recovered from everything the voyage had taken from them, ate well, slept in the fragrant hall, and allowed the accumulated weight of Troy and the Sicyonos and Aeolus and the Lastrygonians to ease out of their bodies over the long seasons of the island. When Odysseus finally told Circe they needed to go home, she did not refuse him. She told him what was coming, the sirens and how to pass them, and what to stop the men's ears with. She told him about Scylla and Charybdis, the two hazards that faced each other across a narrow strait, and gave him the specific counsel for each that the tradition would later prove he needed. She told him about the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle of Helios grazed, untouched and unaged and sacred, and told him plainly that if those cattle came to any harm, the ship and everyone on it would be lost. She gave him the route and the warnings. She also told him that before any of that, he needed to go somewhere else first. The edge of the world, in the Greek geographical imagination, was where the sun's light did not reach. Beyond the world's known rim, the tradition placed a shore washed by the stream Oceanus, the great encircling river at the edge of everything, and on that shore, if a person dug a pit in the earth and filled it with the blood of slaughtered animals and waited, the dead would come. The ceremony Odysseus performed on that shore is called a Nicaea. He followed Circe's instructions precisely, digging the pit, pouring in the blood of a black sheep and a black ram, standing back with his sword drawn to keep the shades from drinking until he had spoken to the ones he needed. The dead came up from below in a slow dark current, drawn by the blood, crowding toward the pit, women and young men and old warriors, people killed in battle, and people who had simply died, pressing forward in the way that in the tradition characterizes the dead, which is to say with need, and with a kind of wordless urgency that is not quite emotion, but resembles it. Tiresias came first, as Circe had said he would, the blind prophet of Thebes, dead now and carrying his golden staff still, the one shade the tradition identifies as fully himself in death, retaining his prophetic gift where other shades retain only fragments. He drank from the pit, and his eyes cleared, and he told Odysseus what the voyage still held, the cattle of Helios, the suitors at home waiting, the long way back by water, and something beyond the homecoming that the tradition describes in terms of a further journey still, a man carrying an oar inland until he reached people who did not know what an oar was. The prophecy ends where most prophecies eventually end, which is in old age, in a death that comes gently from the sea. Tiresias said what he had to say, and withdrew, and Odysseus held the other shades back, and let them come one at a time. His mother came. Anticlea, who had been alive when Odysseus left for Troy, was dead now, and the tradition gives her the particular grief of a mother who died waiting, wearing herself out and missing him. She tried to embrace him. 3 times she reached toward him, and could not be held, for the shade of her passing through his hands, and the tradition describes this with a straightforwardness that makes the detail feel very old. The explanation offered is that without flesh and bone, there is nothing to hold, that what persists of the dead, in the tradition's understanding, is neither the body nor quite the mind, but something that can speak and can recognize and can feel and cannot be touched. She told him that Penelope still waited. She told him his father Laertes was alive and grieving on his farm, sleeping rough in the winter, wearing poor clothes out of sorrow, the way grief in the tradition becomes visible in the body and in what the body allows itself. Odysseus stayed beside her as long as the ceremony allowed. The shade of Achilles came, and the exchange between them in the tradition is one of the moments the Odyssey is remembered for most clearly. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, the one who had chosen a short, bright life over a long, obscure one, who had known when he set out that the war would kill him and had gone anyway, was in the underworld declaring that he would give everything to be alive again, that he would rather be the poorest living man, a hired laborer with nothing, than the king of all the dead. The inversion is careful. The Iliad's great champion, the figure whose excellence the war had been organized around, was in death undoing the bargain he had made. The tradition offers this without explaining it, without telling the listener what to think about what it means, that the dead hero, given a voice, chose to renounce the bargain that made him heroic. The exchange simply happens. Bidjark part molts, the exchange tekwith, and Odysseus tells Achilles that his son Neoptolemus has become a great warrior, and Achilles is glad at that, and the shade of him strides away across the field of asphodel, the thin flowers of the underworld meadow, in what the tradition describes as something resembling happiness. When the fleet finally passed the island of the Sirens, Odysseus was tied to the mast by his own orders. He had heard enough of what the Sirens offered. They sang to men from the island, and the songs were of knowledge, of everything that had happened, and everything that would happen, and the tradition holds that the beach around them was white with the bones of sailors who had heard the singing and gone ashore and never left. Odysseus had the men stop their ears with beeswax, carefully pressed in so that no sound could enter, and he alone listened. Alone among his crew, he could hear the singing clearly, because he could not act on it. The ropes held him to the mast while he wrenched against them, and the ship moved through the strait by the effort of men who could hear nothing at all, and felt only the pull of the oars under their hands, and the ordinary resistance of the sea. The island fell behind them. The singing faded. The men unplugged their ears. Scylla was a creature living in a cliff above a narrow passage, with 6 long necks and 6 heads and teeth in multiple rows, and the tradition describes her as immortal and immovable, something installed in the landscape rather than living in it, waiting. Charybdis was across the strait from her, a whirlpool that opened 3 times a day and swallowed the sea down to the seabed, and then belched it back up, visible from a distance as a roiling and a sound. Circe had told Odysseus to keep to Scylla's side of the strait, because losing 6 men to her mouths was survivable, and losing the whole ship to Charybdis was not. He did as she had said. Circe took 6 men from the deck, 1 for each of her heads. Odysseus watched it happen and could not prevent it. The tradition specifies that he had been warned against arming himself or attempting to fight her, that she was simply what she was, and the passage was the cost. The 6 men called his name as they were carried up into the cliff. The ship moved through. The island of Thrinacia was exactly what Circe had said it would be. The cattle of Helios were there, moving across the meadows in the slow way of cattle, undying, their coats gleaming, attended by 2 daughters of Helios who never aged. Odysseus had warned the crew before they landed. He had told them what Circe and Tiresias had both said. The crew agreed, pledging to leave the cattle alone. They were stranded on the island for a month when contrary winds trapped them, and when their own provisions ran out, they waited on what the island offered in the way of birds and fish, and it was not enough. Eurylochus, who had also survived Circe's hall by staying outside it, spoke to the crew while Odysseus was away, and the argument he made was the argument of men in a specific kind of desperation, that they were going to die on the island if they did not eat, and that dying there was worse than taking the risk. They slaughtered the best of Helios's cattle while Odysseus slept, and roasted the meat, and the tradition describes an omen that accompanied it. The hides crawled by themselves, and the meat on the spits lowed like living animals. The crew ate anyway. For 6 days they ate. On the 7th day, the wind came, and they put to sea. Helios had already appealed to Zeus. He had asked for justice, threatening that if he received none, he would take his light down to the underworld and shine there instead, among the dead, and Zeus had promised a reckoning. When the fleet was clear of the island and on open water, the storm came. It was not like the storm at Aeolia, which had been the mechanical consequence of the bag opening. It was different in quality, a single massive wave, and a thunderbolt into the ship, the mast falling, the ship coming apart, the men going into the water. All of them went into the water. Odysseus was the only one who came back up. He clung to the keel and to the mast, which floated, and the current took him back toward the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis. He survived Charybdis a second time by clinging to a fig tree above the whirlpool and dropping back down onto the keel when it was thrown up again. The men were gone. He drifted for 9 days before the current brought him to Ogygia. Ogygia was where Calypso lived. The Odyssey names her as a daughter of the Titan Atlas, who holds up the sky, which places her in a particular kind of divine genealogy, older than the Olympians, connected to the generation of gods before Zeus's order was established. She had lived on Ogygia alone for a very long time, in a cave fragrant with burning cedar and cypress, the island around her covered in meadows of violet and parsley and stands of alder and poplar and fragrant cypress. Springs of clear water ran through the grass in 4 separate streams. The island was, by any ordinary measure, beautiful. She kept Odysseus there for 7 years. The tradition holds that she loved him and wanted to keep him with her permanently, offering him immortality, not just long life, but the specific undying existence of a god. Ageless, permanent, the kind of existence that cannot be lost. Odysseus refused. He wanted to go home. The tradition does not present this as a simple choice or a sentimental one. Calypso is not cruel. The island is not a prison in any brutal sense, and what she offered was genuinely extraordinary. The tradition holds rather that what Odysseus was, at the deepest level of what the poem understood him to be, was a man who wanted to return, not to something perfect, not to a guaranteed welcome or a restored world. He wanted the specific island and the specific wife and the specific father on his farm and the specific rocky shores that were not especially good farmland, but were his. The beauty of Calypso's island, in the tradition's understanding of Odysseus, was not the same thing as home, and no quantity of it could substitute. Every day during the 7 years, he sat at the edge of the island in the late afternoon and looked westward across water that gave nothing back. The tradition gives this image a quiet and slightly formal weight. The great survivor of the Trojan War, the man who had walked through the underworld and bound himself to the mast and watched 6 men taken by a creature in a cliff, sitting on a rock at the water's edge, looking toward a horizon that held only more water. Calypso knew what he was looking at. She came to him in the evenings, and she knew it was Athena who finally moved things. She raised Odysseus's case before Zeus in a divine council on Olympus, speaking while Poseidon was away at a feast among the Ethiopians, making use of the window his absence created. She presented the argument clearly that Odysseus had been faithful, that he had honored the gods as a man should, that his suffering had been long enough, and his fate decreed that he should return. Zeus agreed. Hermes was sent to Calypso on Ogygia with the instruction. Calypso received the message, and her response in the tradition is worth holding for a moment. She did not refuse Zeus's order. She knew better than to refuse it, but she pointed out, with some precision, the way the tradition allowed her to point it out, that the gods did not always extend to goddesses the same freedoms they extended to gods, that when a goddess loved a mortal man, the outcome was never left to her choosing in the way it was for gods who loved mortal women. She said what she said plainly, and then she went to find Odysseus and told him he was free to go. He did not believe her at first. He asked her to swear by the river Styx, which is the oath in the tradition that even the gods cannot break. The oath that binds more completely than any other promise, sworn by the water of the underworld. She swore it. He believed her. She helped him build a raft. 4 days of work with good timber from the island's trees, a mast and a sail stitched from cloth she provided, a steering oar. She gave him provisions, bread and water and dark wine, and a light wind to carry him east. She showed him the stars to steer by, particularly the Pleiades and the late-setting Boötes, and the Bear, which the tradition calls by the name Wen, turning in place, watching Orion, never dipping below the horizon in the northern sky. On the 18th day, he could see the mountains of the Phaeacians' island, Scheria, rising out of the water like a dark shape against the lighter sky. Poseidon saw him on the open water. He had been away at the feast among the Ethiopians. He was returning. He saw the raft and knew in a moment what had happened, that in his absence the other gods had moved, and that the man he had been working against for years was within sight of land and help. He raised a storm. It was the last major storm of the voyage, and it scattered the raft and threw Odysseus into the water and worked against him with everything Poseidon could bring to bear within the constraints of the fate already set. Odysseus survived. The sea goddess Ino, called Leucothea, the white goddess, gave him her veil to use as a float, and he swam for 2 days before the shore of Scheria finally took him. He came up from the water crawling, cut by rocks, covered in the brine that the tradition uses to mark a survivor, the physical trace of the sea on a body that the sea could not keep. The Phaeacians were a people the tradition places at a comfortable distance from the world's troubles, skilled sailors whose ships moved by thought rather than by oar, living in a prosperous city ruled by a king named Alcinous and his queen Arete. They had once lived nearer to the Cyclops, the tradition notes, and had moved to escape the hostility of those neighbors, which places them quietly in the same mythological geography as the earlier wanderings without returning to it. Their hospitality toward Odysseus was comprehensive and almost ceremonially complete. The games, the singer Demodocus, who performed songs from the Trojan War and noticed Odysseus weeping at the table into his cloak, the feast, the gifts the ship finally provided. It was among the Phaeacians that Odysseus finally told the story of the wanderings. The tradition places his own account of Polyphemus, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, and the cattle of Helios inside the poem as a recitation. Odysseus seated at the table of Alcinous, the hall of the Phaeacians around him, telling his own story to an audience that listened and gave him passage home in return. The poem contains itself, in a way. The wanderings are recounted by the man who survived them, to people who would never have known of them otherwise, and the telling becomes part of what allows him to finally leave. The Phaeacians brought him home while he slept. Their ship was that kind, swift and self-directed, reaching Ithaca before dawn, the sailors lifting Odysseus from the ship, still sleeping, and laying him on the shore with all his gifts arranged around him, and the ship departing on the homeward water, and the light beginning to come. The tradition holds that Poseidon, watching the Phaeacian ship return, turned it to stone in the harbor of Scheria as it came home, punishment for carrying Odysseus, a reminder that the cost of hospitality offered to the man he opposed had been felt. The Phaeacians saw it happen and understood what it meant. That chapter of the tradition ends there, with the stone ship in the harbor and the people gathered around it, and the island continuing its life under the changed sky. On Ithaca, everything waited, as it had been waiting for 20 years, 10 years of war and 10 years of wandering, and the house full of men who had arrived to court Penelope, eating through Odysseus's stores, occupying his hall. Odysseus did not know the full shape of what waited. He woke on the shore, surrounded by gifts and fog. Athena had covered the island in mist, so that he would not recognize it immediately and would not give himself away. He woke and thought, in the first moments of waking, that the Phaeacians had deceived him and left him on some unknown shore. He listed his gifts and found them all present. He sat beside them in the mist, not knowing where he was. Athena came to him as a young shepherd and let him misidentify the island before telling him where he was. And even in the telling, the tradition gives her a kind of pleasure in the exchange, the observation that Odysseus had remained characteristically himself, giving her a careful false story, even in this moment, not revealing who he was, even when speaking to an apparent stranger on an apparently strange shore. She revealed herself and recognized him and told him what waited in the house and began to plan. The tradition spent its last books in Ithaca. The wanderings were over. The ships were gone. The crew was gone. The 12 ships that had left Troy reduced to nothing by the slow arithmetic of the voyage. Odysseus stood alone on his own island in the fog, with a pile of bronze and gold around him, and the long work of homecoming still to do. The ocean continued its work on the shore of Ithaca, as it had continued while he was away. The water moved against the rocks with the same motion it had been using since before the story began, indifferent to the man now sitting beside his gifts in the gray morning, indifferent to what had happened on the water between Troy and this shore. The sea does not record what moves across it. It returns to its own pattern as soon as the keel has passed. The wanderings exist now the way they have always existed after they were over, as a shape traced backward from the shore of Ithaca to the burning coast of Troy, a line moving through Ismarus and the island of the Lotus Eaters, and the cave of the Cyclops, and the floating island of Aeolus, and the harbor of the Laestrygonians, and Aea, and the edge of the world where the dead come up to drink, and the Sirens' island, and the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, and the island of the sun's cattle, and the wreckage of the last ship, and the surface of the deep water, and the shore of Ogygia, and the raft, and the storm, and the shore of the Phaeacians, and the sleeping passage home, a line that took 10 years to trace, and that the tradition has been tracing ever since. In recitation, and papyrus and manuscript, and reading, the line staying more or less the same through all the changes in what carried it. There is a version of the story in which the specific geography of the wanderings was always deliberately unreachable. The islands are placed at the edges of the Greek world, not because a mapmaker forgot to mark them, but because they were never meant to be found on a map. They existed in the space the tradition left open between the end of the known world and the beginning of what the known world could not account for. The Cyclops lived there. Circe lived there. The dead were reachable from there by people who knew the ceremony. These were not gaps in the map to be filled in by later explorers. They were a different kind of place, built out of what the world cannot offer and what the dead cannot return from, and what even a very determined man cannot resist forever if he is made to wait long enough in a beautiful place with a clear stream running through the grass. Ogygia persists in the tradition long after Odysseus has left it. Calypso is still there on her island. The cedar fires still burn in the cave. The meadows of violet and parsley still hold whatever light is available in the late afternoon, the stems bending slightly in the same wind that fills the sails of ships passing somewhere beyond the horizon. The springs run through the grass in 4 separate streams, as they have always done. The wolves and lions of Circe's island are still moving through the trees around the stone hall. The Lotus Eater's island is still warm and still grows whatever the lotus plant is. The tradition never names it precisely, which may itself be part of the point. The Sirens' island is still there. The tradition's silence about what happened to the Sirens after Odysseus passed them leaving the island intact, and the singing presumably continuing, though there were no more sailors to hear it in the way the story required. The poem ends where it ends, at a particular moment in Ithaca, though the world the poem assembled along the way remains assembled after the poem stops. The wine-dark sea continues to exist past the last line. The rosy-fingered dawn continues to arrive each morning over whatever islands the tradition populated across that sea, carrying its light across the water from Thrace to Ithaca to the farthest edge of the encircling ocean. The formula persists past the narrative that required it, the way a very old phrase persists past the context that first produced it, usable again, fitted to the rhythm, available the next time the morning arrives and requires its name. The 10-year voyage existed to bring a man home, and the tradition's understanding of what home meant was specific enough to require everything that came before it. Not comfort, not safety, not even happiness, necessarily, though the tradition moves towards something that resembles it. Home was the place that was his, the particular configuration of rocky ground and sea-facing hillside and olive trees, and a house and a wife who had waited, and a son who had grown up in his absence, and a father who had retreated to grief on his farm, while the world waited to see how the story would end. The tradition said he got there. The wanderings were real in the way the tradition made things real. The losses were real. The islands were real. The decade of open water between the burning coast and the fog-covered shore was real. And then the fog lifted, and the island was there, and the story continued in the only way the story could continue, which was by arriving. The water keeps moving,